So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. As I said, I am in my third year of PhD. I'm hoping to submit by end of September next year. So I'm currently in the analysis stage. The initial, what I'll be presenting today, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Yep, go for it.
So what I'm presenting today are initial reflections on the familiarization stage of Braun Clarke's reflexive thematic analysis. So not final findings or answers, but reflections and some questions that have come up for me from what I've been reading. So prior to that, I'm going to give you a brief background literature on burnout that is relevant to the analysis that I'm doing and initial thoughts that I'm having. I have presented the last couple of years, so some of that background might be a little bit repetitive. I'm going to try and run through that quickly, but have detailed the slides so that if anyone hasn't been there the last couple of years and you're interested, you can learn more. But the first thing that I want to emphasize is that while I am hopefully doing a strong critique of the language and the discourse of burnout, I'm not denying that there is distress, or from what I'm noticing, multiple different types of distress that are very real and that are happening for people and participants that they've experienced in this work. I do want to acknowledge and honour the significance of those experiences that participants have spoken about, particularly in respect to a feeling of being unseen and unheard in their experiences that has been articulated by many participants. So, try and run through this quickly. The term burnout was coined by a psychologist, Freudenberger, in the 1970s, and a decade later expanded on and popularized further by another psychologist, Maslach, who created an inventory called the, I think it's called the Maslach inventory. Originally, and still used today in some studies, the term burnout involved three things: exhaustion, loss of empathy towards service users and or cynicism towards one's job, and a reduced sense of effectiveness or productivity. So this was predominantly a neoliberal concept, heavily related to employment productivity. It's worth noting that Freudenberger appropriated this term from his work with people in New York City using substances, where the word referred to burning out from chronic substance use. He felt that he was burning out from chronic work stress. So a lot of those early explorations that he did to coin this term were heavily based on his own autobiographical experiences. I think it's interesting to note this because from the very beginning of the origins of the concept, it had contained one specific contextual meaning and has been appropriated onto something else entirely, which speaks to how the term proliferates in today's context, as well as to the very origins of its ambiguity. Another thing to quickly note is that early on, studies on the concept were limited to these so-called caring professions, which some have argued has led to assumptions about this type of work in particular, such as that there is something inherent to caring professions, specifically aspects of relational care, such as empathy, that inevitably lead to this thing called burnout. The evolution and expansion of the concept has taken place within an emerging and expanding political economy of biomedical neoliberalism. Initially, the term was more reflective of neoliberalism, with some critiques of the ways in which it individualizes the effects of neoliberal and managerialist workplace contexts. There was largely a gap for the first few decades in terms of any relationship to the biomedical aspects of these caring professions, of this work, and the context of burnout. And the solutions primarily boiled down to another ambiguous and individualizing concept of self-care. But I'll come back to that. Since COVID, the term has really expanded exponentially across society outside of caring professions. It has weakening parameters and increasing ambiguity and an increasing conflation with exhaustion. The latter had been shifting prior to COVID, with Maslach herself writing in 2016 on the differences between studies on the concept, with many only measuring the component of exhaustion. Since COVID, it has been written about as both a result of work-related stress and now caring responsibilities. But there's an absence of any analysis of structural factors relating to COVID and caring responsibilities and work, for example, gender, race, class, or disability. And in addition, there is this recent biomedical expansion in the push to find a biological process of burnout. Within this, there has been a further pathologization of the concept in that it is written and spoken about more often now in terms of psychological injury and in the quest for that biological process. And some causes are now posited to be personality traits of perfectionism or emotional intelligence. There is also an ongoing debate as to whether burnout differs from other psychological diagnoses, specifically depression, and how to determine this. Solutions have still remained the individualized self-care, but they've expanded to the therapized solution of CBT as well. And yes, I'm not going to read all of these out, but if you want to take a shot of them and look at them later, it's just noting through the decades that it still remains ambiguous, the term. There is still no one definition, and it is still contested. Further, critiques maintain that the concept is acontextual, apolitical, individualizing, conflated with exhaustion, diffuse with weakening parameters. And 32 years ago, psychologist Burisk found in his compilation of studies on burnout over 130 symptoms in the literature. It wouldn't be surprising if that has increased since then. So that comes to the context for this study. Social work in the area of mental health in Australia. And that context includes a history of social work aligning with psychiatry, with the biomedical model, arguably for legitimacy, alongside this professionalization project. Burnout has proliferated throughout our practice with workshops and trainings on burnout as this taken for granted truth with the taken for granted assumptions that come with it has been in every workplace I've been in. It is also in trainings provided by the AASW as well. Further invisibilizing real structural and systemic harms and injustice. Therefore, my study is Burnout in the Context of Biomedical Neoliberalism, a qualitative study grounded in a critical post-structural theoretical framework. So very quickly, I am, as I said, in the analysis stage, so I've completed data collection. There were 16 social workers total. There were 12 women and 4 men. The age range varies, as you can see. Years in practice varies between 1 and 31 years. Locations were very mixed as well. So I conducted in person and Zoom. And on Zoom, I met with people all around Australia. In urban, regional, and rural locations. And the organisation types that they worked and had worked in were a mix of government, non-government, for-profit, not-for-profit. And we took the field of mental health broadly speaking. So there were some social workers who brought experience of, say, inpatient hospital mental health units, some from community mental health organisations, and some who worked in other fields like drug and alcohol, but obviously worked with mental health because it intersects, I think, with everything that we do, every field that we could be in. So in stage 1, there were 7 semi-structured individual interviews and body mapping, which I really won't be touching on today, I'm sorry, but hopefully there'll be another presentation solely on the body mapping. But there were 6 individual body maps and 1 group body map with 3 social workers. And then in stage 2, some months later, there were 4 semi-structured individual interviews, and there were 3 focus groups with about 3 social workers in each. So the very first question that I asked in all of the interviews, and the body maps were began with interviewing as well. So everyone was asked the question, what does the word burnout mean to you? Throughout the interviews, participants would, of course, draw on more descriptions, but I actually sat down and compiled the very initial responses that they gave into this word cloud. So I wanted to visualize the fact that every single participant, bar one who used the word tired, used the word exhaustion. So there is pretty much the only commonality, or maybe the only commonality, was that everyone used this word exhaustion. So that speaks to the conflation with exhaustion. There was another common word, but it's written differently, but that is function. So people talked about productivity a lot. So there's reduced function, unable to function. I think there's lacking capacity, all of these things. So often the word exhaustion was actually the first one used by people. It does raise a question that I've had throughout this research of whether we are really just talking about exhaustion, what makes this different. But as you can see, there are a range of other descriptions there. As you can see as well, they're all quite individualizing. They're all about the individual person, whether wellness or unwellness, mental health issue, stress, etc. So overall, you can see the cerebral way in which we think about the concept in these verbal descriptions. And what is interesting is that my next question asks participants if there are any images that come to mind when they hear the word. And again, there were other images throughout the interviews, but I did a Google search for images of the closest representations to compile for you. So you can immediately see variation in the imagery depicting this word. You have a couple of the more common or stereotypical depictions in the matchstick metaphor or the burning fuse, but then you have diverging images of the headless chook. So that corresponds to the word frazzled that was in the previous slide. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the unable to get out of bed, described by 3 participants, or the Victorian child with plague, which was an actual description from a participant. You can see more vividly the differences in what this word means to people. This is where the ambiguity and amorphousness begins. Is burnout an endpoint or a spectrum? Is it too much energy, the headless chook, or no energy at all? Is it a process? You also get to see differences in the bottom and top corners where, interestingly, they're now drawing on systemic and structural meanings. So you've got in the top right corner, the ivory tower, with the participant describing shaking the fist at the ivory tower. That was about management and managerialist practices. And then in the opposite corner, you've got the Terminator that was described for New South Wales Health. And next to the Terminator, you have an image depicting climate change, which was a metaphor that a participant used. I'll come back to the ways in which creative and artistic approaches seem to enhance alternative meaning making. I'm just, 2 minutes left. So I'm going to very quickly summarize that related to the differences in the imagery. One of the things that has become quite noticeable in the transcripts is that there are many discrepancies amongst all the transcripts within the transcripts. So that's on what burnout is, that's on the causes, and it's also in using particular other words when trying to explain burnout. So the discrepancies seem to point to what is visible and what is invisible. In stage 1, there was a less of a visibility of neoliberalism in the discourse of self-care, for example, but that was strengthened in stage 2 and potentially seemed to be social workers interacting and building off each other in the focus groups. Their analysis was strengthening in those discussions. But what was then invisible in stage 2 seems to be the biomedical aspect, the pathologization. And so as examples, these two quotes speak to, these were in stage 2, and they both are different participants talking about the shifts that were happening in the ways in which they were naming the systemic and structural components. And these were in stage 2 as well, the invisibilizing and the pathologizing of self-care. So with the first person saying, I get really frustrated when I hear emerging social workers talk about self-care, and the first thing they say is, I'm going to sit in the bath and have a glass of wine. And I'm like, did you go to the GP? Have you followed up on all your medical tests? Have you seen a psychologist recently? Are you prescribed any medication? Are you taking that medication? And this other participant is talking about taking accountability. So one of the discrepancies was in participants overall clearly articulating the neoliberal practices and the injustices that they were witnessing in the work, so systemic drivers of their experiences, but then still this uptake of self-responsibility in response to that. And in order to not go over time, these are some just further reflections that I've written in the familiarization stage, my own reflections, and they're all just repetitions of the discrepancies that I'm seeing. And there was this one quote, self-care is so important, but does it fix or prevent burnout? So there were times when participants actually articulated some of these discrepancies, and some did that with the word boundaries as well. But an example with boundaries is that down the bottom, one participant would be talking about boundaries a lot. At one point, he identifies that it's not enough. It's not enough in the face of the overwork and all of those conditions. But then later in the transcript, he again says that self-care and boundaries are what he values most. So there's this push and pull. And in conclusion, this really speaks to, for me, possibly the nature of dominant discourses, in that there is a push and pull, but for these participants, there's never a total recruitment into this idea. There's that push and pull of these ideas, but also resistance to those as well. And that's really interesting. And I think that the contradiction and discrepancy speaks to that. And I think that that makes sense in that the effects, of living and breathing and swimming in dominant discourse is possibly that there is some recruitment into that. So it led me to 3 very quick hopeful things that I will list. One is just a question I wrote down in my reflections. When I noticed this push-pull or not total recruitment or uptake of dominant discourse, is the problem actually a lack of alternative language? And is that one effect of dominant discourse, to strip away alternative language in order to invisibilize inequity or injustice? And number 2, so in this study, is it suggesting that some possible ways to strengthen the push of the dominant discourse is that in bringing people together and having conversations, i.e. the focus groups, for critical consciousness raising? And number 3, on number 2, for one example is that in those focus groups, there was a strengthened analysis of what many participants experienced as actual bullying or institutional violence that had previously been folded into the discourse of burnout. One participant in a focus group conversation around this emphasizes that's not burnout, that's bullying, when they were building off each other. And then thirdly, in addition to coming together and conversing, is the observation of creativity and art in finding alternative language instead of remaining in the cerebral, both in terms of speaking about the imagery in the interviews, as well as the body maps themselves, which also require their own presentation. It is emerging as another finding that these creative approaches offer different ways of thinking about burnout that expand meaning and imagination of responses. Thank you.
Well done, Natalie. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw it over to some questions.
Sure.
Let me just quickly turn on this. Questions? Stop sharing the screen as well. Stop share so we can see everyone up on the screen. So, questions?
Stop, beep, 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 beep. It's the door. It's the door. Yeah, I mean you close the door, then no problem.
Questions or comments, either from those that are joining us via Zoom, feel free to put your question in the chat or do similar, raise your hand and I'm happy to have you speak to the screen. Questions or comments? Yes.
Can I?
Yes, of course.
I have a question. That's so amazing that I haven't realized before. Is it the burnout associated with workload or overworking? Is it more associated with the paperwork or administrative burden that social workers have to do, or more related to like the perceived emotional emotional charge or emotionality of the nature of the social work?
Yeah, I think one of the, when I was thinking about this presentation, I realized the perceived causes or drivers would be a whole other presentation on its own. But there was such variation just in that as well. So there was mention of both of those things, as well as witnessing oppression or oppressive practices and violence and injustice. One of the more common ones were the neoliberal factors, KPIs, being overworked, being understaffed, all of those things. Yeah.
Sue.
Thank you very much. I think I saw your presentation 2 years ago, maybe not last year, and it's just sensational to see where you've taken this and what you're doing with it. So thanks a lot. I was thinking when you were speaking about this concept burnout, I wonder if anybody's written or thought about the Westernity, I'm making up a word, the Westernness of the concept, and if it flowed through in your any of your research. Because I remember when stress became a concept, like an invented concept, reading people who might, for example, be Vietnamese and trying to explain to their families that they were suffering stress and not having the language for it, and saying, I'm suffering busyness, trying to explain what this concept means. And yet now, presumably in Vietnam, stress is a concept. They use the English word for it. So just wondering if you had any reflection on the Westernity of this.
Yeah, I think that's been on my mind from the beginning, but I think the closest that I've found so far, and I'm yet to revisit the literature and go deeper into that, but is Vicki Reynolds when she writes about spiritual pain and critiques the westernized burnout. It's still a neoliberal critique about the individualization. That's the closest I can think of at the moment.
It's nice, thank you.
Yeah.
And in a related comment that was just put up via Zoom, thank you, Michael. Michael says, very interesting. I'm doing a PhD on the well-being of social workers from diverse cultural backgrounds. I wonder if anyone talked about institutional care or organizational care. I asked this question and participants were quite quiet. That speaks a lot.
Thank you for that. No, that particular term didn't come up, but in some of the individual interviews, but more so in the focus groups, there were definitely questions about the organizational responsibility, especially when it came to, yes, the administrative side of things, but also the context of bullying and harassment in the workplace.
Join me in thanking Natalie Femia. Thank you so much.